A letter to Lord Somebody. Shall I venture to say, my Lord, that in our late conversation you were inclined to the party which you adopted rather by the feelings of your good nature than by the conviction of your judgment? We laid open the foundations of society, and you feared that the curiosity of this search might endanger the ruin of the whole fabric. You would readily have allowed my principle, but you dreaded the consequences. You thought that having once entered upon these reasonings, we might be carried insensibly and irresistibly farther than at first we could either have imagined or wished. But for my part, my Lord, I then thought, and am still of the same opinion, that error, and not truth of any kind, is dangerous. That ill conclusions can only flow from false propositions, and that to know whether any proposition be true or false, it is a preposterous method to examine it by its apparent consequences. These were the reasons which induced me to go so far into that inquiry, and they are the reasons which direct me in all my inquiries. I had indeed often reflected on that subject before I could prevail on myself to communicate my reflections to anybody. They were generally melancholy enough, as those usually are which carry us beyond the mere surface of things, and which would undoubtedly make the lives of all thinking men extremely miserable, if the same philosophy which caused the grief did not at the same time administer the comfort. On considering political societies, their origin, their constitution, and their effects, I have sometimes been in a good deal more than doubt whether the Creator did ever really intend man for a state of happiness. He has mixed in his cup a number of natural evils. In spite of the boasts of Stoicism, they are evils. And every endeavor which the art and policy of mankind has used from the beginning of the world to this day, in order to alleviate or cure them, has only served to introduce new mischiefs, or to aggravate and inflame the old. Besides this, the mind of man itself is too active and restless a principle ever to settle on the true point of quiet. It discovers every day some craving want in a body, which really wants but little. It every day invents some new artificial rule to guide that nature which, if left to itself, were the best and surest guide. It finds out imaginary beings prescribing imaginary laws, and then it raises imaginary terrors to support a belief in the beings and an obedience to the laws. Many things have been said, and very well, undoubtedly, on the subjection in which we should preserve our bodies to the government of our understanding. But enough has not been said upon the restraint which our body necessities ought to lay on the extravagant sublimities and eccentric rovings of our minds. The body, or as some love to call it, our inferior nature, is wiser in its own plain way, and attends its own business more directly than the mind with all its boasted subtlety. In the state of nature, Without question, mankind was subjected to many and great inconveniences. Want of union, want of mutual assistance, want of a common arbitrator to resort to in their differences. These were evils which they could not but have felt pretty severely on many occasions. The original children of the earth lived with their brethren of the other kinds in much equality. Their diet must have been confined almost wholly to the vegetable kind. And the same tree which in its flourishing state produced them berries, in its decay gave them an habitation. The mutual desires of the sexes uniting their bodies and affections, and the children which are the results of these intercourses introduced first the notion of society, and taught its conveniences. This society, founded in natural appetites and instincts, and not in any positive institution, I shall call natural society. Thus far nature went and succeeded, but man would go farther. The great error of our nature is not to know where to stop, not to be satisfied with any reasonable acquirement, not to compound with our condition, but to lose all we have gained by an insatiable pursuit after more. Man found a considerable advantage by this union of many persons to form one family. He therefore judged that he would find his account proportionably in an union of many families into one body politic. And as nature has formed no bond of union to hold them together, he supplied this defect by laws. This is political society, and hence the sources of what are usually called states, civil societies, or governments, into some form of which, more extended or restrained, all mankind have gradually fallen, and since it has so happened, and that we owe an implicit reverence to all the institutions of our ancestors, we shall consider these institutions with all that modesty with which we ought to conduct ourselves in examining a received opinion. By the way, look up here, you see it's a Vindication of Natural Society. That's the title. But with all that freedom and candor which we owe to truth wherever we find it, or however it may contradict our own notions, or oppose our own interests. There is a most absurd and audacious method of reasoning avowed by some bigots and enthusiasts, and through fear assented to by some wiser and better men. It is this: they argue against a fair discussion of popular prejudices, because, say they, though they would be found without any reasonable support, yet the discovery might be productive of the most dangerous consequences. Absurd and blasphemous notion, as if all happiness was not connected with the practice of virtue, which necessarily depends upon the knowledge of truth. That is, upon the knowledge of those unalterable relations which Providence has ordained that everything should bear to every other. These relations, which are truth itself, the foundation of virtue, and consequently the only measure of happiness, should be likewise the only measures by which we should direct our reasoning. To these we should conform in good earnest, and not think to force nature and the whole order of her system by a compliance with our pride and folly, to conform to our artificial regulations. It is by conformity to this method we owe the discovery of the few truths we know, and the little liberty and rational happiness we enjoy. We have something fairer play than a reasoner could have expected formerly, and we derive advantages from it which are very visible. The fabric of superstition has in this our age and nation received much ruder shocks than it had ever felt before. And through the chinks and breaches of our prison, we see such glimmerings of light, and feel such refreshing airs of liberty, as daily raise our ardor for more. The miseries derived to mankind from superstition under the name of religion, and of ecclesiastical tyranny under the name of church government, have been clearly and usefully exposed. We begin to think and to act from reason and from nature alone. This is true of several, but by far the majority is still in the same old state of blindness and slavery, and much is it to be feared that we shall perpetually relapse, whilst the real productive cause of all this superstitious folly, enthusiastical nonsense, and holy tyranny holds a reverend place in the estimation even of those who are otherwise enlightened. Civil government borrows a strength from ecclesiastical, and artificial laws receive a sanction from artificial revelations. The ideas of religion and government are closely connected, and whilst we receive government as a thing necessary, or even useful to our well-being, we shall in spite of us draw in as a necessary, though undesirable consequence, an artificial religion of some kind or other. To this the vulgar will always be voluntary slaves, and even those of a rank of understanding superior will now and then involuntarily feel its influence. It is therefore of the deepest concernment to us to be set right in this point, and to be well satisfied whether civil government be such a protector from natural evils, and such a nurse and increaser of blessings as those of warm imaginations promise. In such a discussion, far am I from proposing in the least to reflect on our most wise form of government, no more than I would, in the freer parts of my philosophical writings, mean to object to the piety, truth, and perfection of our most excellent church. Both, I am sensible, have their foundations on a rock. No discovery of truth can prejudice them. On the contrary, the more closely the origin of religion and government is examined, the more clearly their excellences must appear. They come purified from the fire. My business is not with them, having entered a protest against all objections from these quarters. I may the more freely inquire from history and experience how far policy has contributed in all times to alleviate those evils which Providence, that perhaps has designed us for a state of imperfection, has imposed, how far our physical skill has cured our constitutional disorders, and whether it may not have introduced new ones, curable perhaps by no skill. In looking over any state to form a judgment on it, it presents itself in two lights, the external and the internal. The first, that relation which it bears in point of friendship or enmity to other states. The second, that relation which its component parts, the governing and the governed, bear to each other. The first part of the external view of all states, their relation as friends, makes so trifling a figure in history that I am very sorry to say it affords me but little matter on which to expatiate. The good offices done by one nation to its neighbor, had his lordship lived to our days, to have seen the noble relief given by this nation to the distressed Portuguese, he had perhaps owned this part of his argument a little weakened, but we do not think ourselves entitled to alter his lordship's words, but that we are bound to follow him exactly. All right, back to the text. The good offices done by one nation to its neighbor, the support given in public distress, the relief afforded in general calamity, the protection granted in emergent danger, the mutual return of kindness and civility, would afford a very ample and very pleasing subject for history. But alas, all the history of all times, concerning all nations, does not afford matter enough to fill 10 pages, though it should be spun out by the wire-drawing amplification of a Guicciardini himself. The glaring side is that of enmity. War is the matter which fills all history, and consequently the only, or almost the only view in which we can see the external of political society is in a hostile shape, and the only actions to which we have always seen, and still see all of them intent, are such as tend to the destruction of one another. War, says Machiavel, ought to be the only study of a prince. And by a prince, he means every sort of state, however constituted. He ought, says this great political doctor, to consider peace only as a breathing time, which gives him leisure to contrive and furnishes ability to execute military plans. A meditation on the conduct of political societies made old Hobbes imagine that war was the state of nature. And truly, if a man judged of the individuals of our race by their conduct when united and packed into nations and kingdoms, he might imagine that every sort of virtue was unnatural and foreign to the mind of man. The first accounts we have of mankind are but so many accounts of their butcheries. All empires have been cemented in blood. And in those early periods when the race of mankind began first to form themselves into parties and combinations, the first effect of the combination, and indeed the end for which it seems purposely formed, and best calculated, was their mutual destruction. All ancient history is dark and uncertain. One thing, however, is clear. There were conquerors and conquests in those days, and consequently, all that devastation by which they are formed, and all that oppression by which they are maintained. We know little of Sesostris, but that he led out of Egypt an army of above 700,000 men, that he overran the Mediterranean coast as far as Colchis, that in some places he met but little resistance, and of course shed not a great deal of blood, but that he found in others a people who knew the value of their liberties and sold them dear. Whoever considers the army this conqueror headed, the space he traversed, and the opposition he frequently met, with the natural accidents of sickness and dearth and badness of provision to which he must have been subject in the variety of climates and countries his march lay through, if he knows anything, he must know that even the conqueror's army must have suffered greatly, and that of this immense number but a very small part could have returned to enjoy the plunder accumulated by the loss of so many of their companions and the devastation of so considerable a part of the world. Considering, I say, the vast army headed by this conqueror, whose unwieldy weight was almost alone sufficient to wear down its strength, it will be far from excess to suppose that one half was lost in the expedition. If this was the state of the victorious, and from the circumstances it must have been this at the least, the vanquished must have had a much heavier loss, as the greatest slaughter is always in the flight, and great carnage did in those times and countries ever attend the first rage of conquest. It will therefore be very reasonable to allow on their account as much as, added to the losses of the conqueror, may amount to 1,000,000 of deaths. And then we shall see this conqueror, the oldest we have on the records of history, though, as we have observed before, the chronology of these remote times is extremely uncertain, opening the scene by a destruction of at least 1,000,000 of his species, unprovoked but by his ambition, without any motives but pride, cruelty, and madness, and without any benefit to himself. For Justin expressly tells us he did not maintain his conquests, but solely to make so many people in so distant countries feel experimentally how severe a scourge Providence intends for the human race, when he gives one man the power over many, and arms his naturally impotent and feeble rage with the hands of millions, who know no common principle of action, but a blind obedience to the passions of their ruler. The next personage who figures in the tragedies of this ancient theater is Semiramis. For we have no particulars of Ninus, but that he made immense and rapid conquests, which doubtless were not compassed about without the usual carnage. We see an army of about 3,000,000 employed by this martial queen in a war against the Indians. We see the Indians arming a yet greater, and we behold a war continued with much fury and with various success. This ends in the retreat of the queen, with scarce a third of the troops employed in the expedition, an expedition which, at this rate, must have cost 2 millions of souls on her part, and it is not unreasonable to judge that the country which was the seat of war must have been an equal sufferer. But I am content to detract from this, and to suppose that the Indians lost only half so much. And then the account stands thus. In this war alone, for Semiramis had other wars, in this single reign, And in this one spot of the globe did 3 millions of souls expire, with all the horrid and shocking circumstances which attend all wars, and in a quarrel in which none of the sufferers could have the least rational concern. The Babylonian, Assyrian, Median, and Persian monarchies must have poured out seas of blood in their formation and in their destruction. The armies and fleets of Xerxes, their numbers, the glorious stand made against them, and the unfortunate event of all his mighty preparations are known to everybody. In this expedition, draining half Asia of its inhabitants, he led an army of about 2 millions to be slaughtered and wasted by 1,000 fatal accidents, in the same place where his predecessors had before, by a similar madness, consumed the flower of so many kingdoms, and wasted the force of so extensive an empire. It is a cheap calculation to say that the Persian Empire, in its wars against the Greeks and Scythians, threw away at least 4 millions of its subjects, to say nothing of its other wars, and the losses sustained in them. These were their losses abroad, but the war was brought home to them, first by Agesilaus, and afterwards by Alexander. I have not, in this retreat, the books necessary to make very exact calculations, nor is it necessary to give more than hints to one of your lordship's erudition. You will recollect his uninterrupted series of success. You will run over his battles. You will call to mind the carnage which was made. You will give a glance at the whole, and you will agree with me that to form this hero, no less than 1,200,000 lives must have been sacrificed. But no sooner had he fallen himself a sacrifice to his vices than 1,000 breaches were made for ruin to enter, and to give the last hand to this sense of misery and destruction. His kingdom was rent and divided, which served to employ the more distinct parts to tear each other to pieces, and bury the whole in blood and slaughter. The kings of Syria and of Egypt, the kings of Pergamus and Macedon, without intermission worried each other for above 200 years, until at last a strong power, arising in the west, rushed in upon them and silenced their tumults by involving all the contending parties in the same destruction. It is little to say that the contentions between the successors of Alexander depopulated that part of the world of at least 2 millions. The struggle between the Macedonians and Greeks, and before that the disputes of the Greek commonwealths among themselves for an unprofitable superiority, form one of the bloodiest scenes in history. One is astonished how such a small spot could furnish men sufficient to sacrifice to the pitiful ambition possessing 5,000 or 6,000 more acres, or 2 or 3 more villages. Yet to see the acrimony and bitterness with which this was disputed between the Athenians and Lacedaemonians What armies cut off? What fleets sunk and burnt? What a number of cities sacked, and their inhabitants slaughtered and captived! One would be induced to believe the decision of the fate of mankind, at least depended upon it. But these disputes ended as all such ever have done, and ever will do, in a real weakness of all parties, a momentary shadow, and dream of power in someone, and the subjection of all to the yokes of a stranger who knows how to profit of their divisions. This at least was the case of the Greeks, and surely from the earliest accounts of them to their absorption into the Roman Empire, we cannot judge that their intestine divisions and their foreign wars consume less than 3 millions of their inhabitants. What an Akeldama! What a field of blood Sicily has been in ancient times, whilst the mode of its government was controverted between the republican and tyrannical parties, and the possession struggled for by the natives, the Greeks, the Carthaginians, and the Romans, your lordship will easily recollect. You will remember the total destruction of such bodies as an army of 300,000 men. You will find every page of its history dyed in blood, and blotted and confounded by tumults, rebellions, massacres, assassinations, proscriptions, and a series of horror beyond the histories, perhaps, of any other nation in the world. Though the histories of all nations are made up of similar matter. I once more excuse myself in point of exactness for want of books, but I shall estimate the slaughters in this island but at 2 millions, which your lordship will find much short of the reality. Let us pass by the wars, and the consequences of them, which wasted Graecia Magna before the Roman power prevailed in that part of Italy. They are perhaps exaggerated. Therefore I shall only rate them at 1 million. Let us hasten to open that great scene which establishes the Roman Empire and forms the grand catastrophe of the ancient drama. This empire, whilst in its infancy, began by an effusion of human blood scarcely credible. The neighboring little states teemed for new destruction. The Sabines, the Samnites, the Aequi, the Volsci, the Hetrurians, were broken by a series of slaughters which had no interruption for some hundreds of years. Slaughters which upon all sides consumed more than 2 millions of the wretched people. The Gauls, rushing into Italy about this time, added the total destruction of their own armies to those of the ancient inhabitants. In short, it were hardly possible to conceive a more horrid and bloody picture, if that the Punic Wars that ensued soon after did not present one that far exceeds it. Here we find that climax of devastation and ruin, which seemed to shake the whole earth. The extent of this war, which vexed so many nations, and both elements, and the havoc of the human species caused in both, really astonishes beyond expression. When it is nakedly considered, and those matters which are apt to divert our attention from it, the characters, actions, and designs of the persons concerned, are not taken into the account. These wars, I mean those called the Punic Wars, could not have stood the human race in less than 3 millions of the species, and yet this forms but a part only, and a very small part, of the havoc caused by the Roman ambition. The war with Mithridates was very little less bloody. That prince cut off at one stroke 150,000 Romans by a massacre. In that war, Sylla destroyed 300,000 men at Chaeronea. He defeated Mithridates' army under Dorilaus and slew 300,000. This great and unfortunate prince lost another 300,000 before Cyzicum. In the course of the war, he had innumerable other losses, and having many intervals of success, he revenged them severely. He was at last totally overthrown, and he crushed to pieces the king of Armenia, his ally, by the greatness of his ruin. All who had connections with him shared the same fate. The merciless genius of Sylla had its full scope, and the streets of Athens were not the only ones which ran with blood. At this period the sword, glutted with foreign slaughter, turned its edge upon the bowels of the Roman Republic itself, and presented a scene of cruelties and treasons enough almost to obliterate the memory of all external devastations. I intended, my Lord, to have proceeded in a sort of method in estimating the numbers of mankind cut off in these wars which we have on record, but I am obliged to alter my design. Such a tragical uniformity of havoc and murder would disgust your lordship as much as it would me, and I confess I already feel my eyes ache by keeping them so long intent on so bloody a prospect. I shall observe little on the Servile, the Social, the Gallic, and Spanish wars, nor upon those with Jugurtha, nor Antiochus, nor many others equally important and carried on with equal fury. The butcheries of Julius Caesar alone are calculated by somebody else. The numbers he has been the means of destroying have been reckoned at 1,200,000. But to give your lordship an idea that may serve as a standard by which to measure in some degree the others, you will turn your eyes on Judea, a very inconsiderable spot of the earth in itself, though ennobled by the singular events which had their rise in that country. We're up to page 22. Lord willing, we'll pick up in the next.